22 anos, sou estudante de jornalismo. Estou concluindo o curso, na verdade. E eu venho do Recôncavo das Águas de Salinas da Margarida. Sou filha de uma mulher negra quilombola, marisqueira, filha de pescador. E hoje é uma honra estar aqui com você, com todos. Eu queria, Nikole, que assim, eu acabei contando um pouco da minha história, mas eu queria que você contasse um pouco da sua. Qual foi os caminhos que você traçou para chegar ao New York Times?
That is a very long story because unlike you, I'm not 22 years old. I'm very old.
É uma história muito longa, porque diferente de você, eu não tenho 22 anos.
Sim.
So you said you were not interested in news when you were young, but I really was interested in journalism from a young age. Some of my earliest memories are I used to read the newspaper every day with my dad. So when I was only 11 years old, I got my first letter to the editor published in my local newspaper. And it was about race, it was about a presidential election, and we had a black man running to be president named Jesse Jackson. And he didn't do very well, and I thought that was because he was black. So I wrote a letter, and every day I would go look in the newspaper to see if they had published my letter, and one day they did. So even at 11, I knew I liked how it felt to see something in society that I thought was unfair, and I could write something about it and make other people think about it. So after that, I started to think maybe I would want to be a journalist as a career. So I wrote for my high school paper. When I went to university, I studied history and African American studies because I also love history. And then I got my master's degree in journalism and really worked my way from small newspapers to larger newspapers until I got to the New York Times.
O contexto dos Estados Unidos é um contexto diferente do contexto brasileiro no quesito comunicação. Mas há algo que é único entre os dois países, que é a questão do racismo, e de que forma a gente pode combater esse fenômeno que acontece em todos os locais. Eu queria saber de que forma você enxerga esse processo de comunicação decolonial dos dias atuais e como esses discursos e posicionamentos podem ser fortalecidos dentro de uma mídia hegemônica.
Well, I think that it depends on how one defines media. So we have, of course, our mainstream media, which is the media of the colonizers. So it tends to represent often power more than I would say it represents truth. So often, on a daily basis, mainstream media just reifies narratives of power, control, and often presents Black and marginalized people in stereotypical ways. But then media also includes Black media, ethnic media, media from other marginalized groups, and those are media that tell the stories of our country from the bottom, and I think tell the story in a more truthful way. So I don't like to just use the umbrella of media because media is created by a lot of different types of people. I am a Black journalist who works for mainstream media and yet try to center the people from the margins within a mainstream organization.
Queria perguntar para ela como foi que surgiu o projeto do livro dela, 1619. Qual foi o principal gatilho ou expertise que ela teve para querer contar essa história?
Every story will go back to my childhood, including this one.
Todas as histórias que ela contar vai voltar sempre para a infância dela, inclusive essa.
When I was in high school, my high school offered a one-semester course on the Black experience. And in that course was the first time that I learned that Black people had a vast history that you could learn. And that was the first time I ever learned the date 1619. And before that, I had never heard that Black people had been in the United States that long, or that there was a ship called the White Lion. And it really made me realize that there's an entire history that exists that powerful people were deciding not to teach to us. So, much like in Brazil, we know that our country practiced slavery, but we are not taught the history very well. And what does that mean for the society that we live in today? And as a journalist, I really wanted not just to write about the conditions of Black people in society today, but to show what caused them, to show that there's nothing wrong with Black people, but we live in a society that has created the inequality that Black people experience. And to do that, as a journalist, you have to go to the past. So for many years, I have been working towards something like the 1619 Project. And then in 2019 was the 400th anniversary. And I wanted to do a big project to commemorate that anniversary. 400th anniversary of the first Africans sold into what would become the United States.
De que forma que ela consegue enxergar a relevância dessa obra, não só para os Estados Unidos, mas como os países que foram escravizados, assim como o Brasil?
I absolutely think that even though the 1619 Project tells the story of the United States, it really tells the story of the world, and certainly of the Atlantic world. So while the details are specific to the United States of America, the large themes of the project are reflected, of course, in Brazil. They're reflected in Colombia. They're reflected in Barbados. They're reflected in Jamaica. I think thematically, we're taught that the history of slavery is the history of Black people. But the history of slavery is the history of the world, and it's just as much the history of the European powers as it is the history of people from Africa. When I came to Brazil shortly after I published the 1619 Project to talk about the 1619 Project, because people in Brazil recognized the relevancy for their own society. And I said back then, Brazil needed its own version of this project to force the society to acknowledge that it was built on slavery, and that you can abolish slavery, but you cannot purge the society of its very foundation. So I think the lessons of that project reverberate across the Atlantic world. Or when you go to Europe, the wealth of Europe was built on the labor of African people over here. If you look at the continent of Africa and how a continent that has so much material wealth, mineral wealth, intellectual wealth can be so poor, that is a result of slavery and colonization. So this is the story of really our entire world. That was a lot. Sorry, I should have broke that up.
Okay.
A gente sabe que o Brasil ele passou por um processo também de escravização, que foi um processo muito difícil também para os brasileiros, mas sobretudo aqui na Bahia. Ela está em um lugar culturalmente rico, historicamente também. Então, questiona para ela o motivo dela querer visitar a Bahia.
For what you just said.
A resposta é por tudo que você falou na pergunta.
Every time I've come to Brazil, people have said, you have to go to Bahia. That if you want to understand Brazil, and if you want to truly experience Black Brazil, that you have to come, that this is the heart of that culture. So I always promise myself, after the last time I was here was 2020, that when I came back, I would find a way to come to Bahia. Every country I go to, I always try to connect into the Black communities there, because that is my purpose. So it's been unfortunately a very short trip, but we've tried to fill it with as many experiences as possible.
Okay.
And if I could just add to that what you said is very key, because so often when we talk about our history and the history of slavery, it is a story of suffering. But we also know that Black people have always resisted, loved, created, and to come to a place and be able to celebrate that aspect of what we have made out of our suffering. I don't know how you can truly experience Brazil without seeing the beauty that we made out of our experiences, and so much of what makes Brazil an essential Black country comes from here.
Pergunta pra ela se ela tem projeto de lançar o livro dela aqui no Brasil.
Okay.
I wish.
Gostaria.
So the way the publishing world works is some publisher in Brazil has to decide they want to translate and distribute the book in Portuguese. I've told my publisher many times to try to make relationships with publishers here who may want to publish the book in Portuguese. It is my dream that we will publish both the adult book. We also have a children's book in Portuguese. It just got translated into Spanish, but not Portuguese. So I hope, and if you're a publisher watching, buy the rights and translate the book into Portuguese.
Diz pra ela que a gente está esperando ansiosamente pela tradução brasileira.
Okay, we are also very anxiously waiting for the translation.